The theater of cruelty unique fois au monde, parce tu en raison d'événements toujours que j'expliquerai, tu n'es pas de present, non un present n'existe pas. Malarme, quant m1 libre, as for my forces, they are only a supplement, the supplement of an accuddle state, it is that there has never been an origin. Artaud, June 6, 1947. And consequently the theaters have not yet begun to exist. This is what one reads in one of Antonin Artaud's last writings, Le Théâtre de la Cruauté, in 84, 1948. And in the same text, a little earlier, the theater of cruelty is defined as the affirmation of a terrible and, moreover, implacably necessity. Artaud, therefore, does not call for destruction, for a new manifestation of negativity. Despite everything that it must ravage in its wake, the theater of cruelty is not the symbol of an absent void. It affirms, it produces affirmation itself in its one full and necessary rigor. But also in its most hidden sense, the sense most often buried, most often diverged from itself, implacable as it is, this affirmation has not yet begun to exist. It is still to be born. Now a necessary affirmation can be born only by being reborn to itself. For Artaud, the future of the theater thus, the future in general is opened only by the anaphora which dates from the prior to birth. Theatricality must traverse and restore existence and flesh in each of their aspects. Thus, whatever can be said of the body can be said of the theater. As we know, Artaud lived the morrow of a dispossession, his proper body, the property and propriety of his body, had been stolen from him at birth by the thieving god who was born in order to pass himself off as me one rebirth doubtless so seekers through Artaud recalls this often a kind of re-education of the organ underscore but this re-education permits the access to a life before birth and after death, through dying I have finally achieved real immortality, p. 110, and not to a death before birth and after life. This is what distinguishes the affirmation of cruelty from romantic negativity, the difference is slight and yet decisive. Lichtenberger, I cannot rid myself of this idea that I was dead before I was born, and that through death I will return to this very state. To die and to be reborn with the memory of one's former existence is called fainting, to awaken with other organs which must first be re-educated is called birth for Artaud. The primary concern is not to die in dying, not to let the thieving god divest him of his life. And I believe that there is always someone else, at the extreme moment of death, to strip us of our own lives, a. p. 162. J. Similarly, Western theater has been separated from the force of its essence, removed from its affirmative essence, its vis affirmativa. And this dispossession occurred from the origin on, is the very movement of origin, of birth as death. This is why a place is left on all the stages of stillborn theater, Le Theater et l'Anatomy, in La Rue, July 1946. The theater is born in its of L, disappearance, and the offspring of this movement has a name, man. The theater of cruelty is to be born by separating death from birth and by earning the name of man. The theater has always been made to do that for which it was not made, the last word on man has not been said. The theater was never made to describe man and what he does. Le Theater sce pot indigenganda, qui musique de troncs par barbes metaliques de barbels nous mangent en état de guerre contre l'homme qui en uscorcitate. Man is quite ill in Aeschylus, but still thinks of himself somewhat as a god and does not want to enter the membrane, and in Euripides, finally, he splashes about in the membrane, forgetting where and when he was a god, Ibid. Indeed, the eve of the origin of this declining, decadent, and negative Western theater must be reawakened and reconstituted in order to revive the implacable necessity of affirmation on its eastern horizon. This is the implacable necessity of an as yet inexistent stage, certainly, but the affirmation is not to be elaborated tomorrow. In some new theater its implacable necessity operates as a permanent force. Cruelty is always at work. The void, the place that is empty and waiting for this theater which has not yet begun to exist, thus measures only the strange distance which separates us from implacable necessity, from the present, or rather the contemporary, active, work of affirmation. Within the space of the unique opening of this distance, the stage of cruelty rears its enigma for us. And it is into this opening that we wish to enter here. If throughout the world today and so many examples bear witness to this in the most striking fashion all theatrical audacity declares its fidelity to Artaud, correctly or incorrectly, but with increasing insistency, then the question of the theater of cruelty, of its present inexistence and its implacable necessity, has the value of a historic question. A historic question not because it could be inscribed I /J within what is called the His 01Y of theater, not because it would be epoch-making within the becoming of theatrical forms, or because it would occupy a position within the succession of models of theatrical representation. This question is Hygric in an absolute and radical sense. It announces the limit of representation. 1. The theater of cruelty is not a representation. It is life itself, in the extent to which life is unrepresentable. Life is the non-representable origin of representation. I have therefore said cruelty as I might have said life, I'd, p. I-14. This life carries man along with it, but is not primarily the life of man. The latter is only a representation of life, and such is the humanist limit of the metaphysics of classical theater. The theater as we practice it can therefore be reproached with a terrible lack of imagination. The theater must make itself the equal of life, not an individual life, that individual aspect of life in which characters triumph, but the sort of liberated life which sweeps away human individuality and in which man is only a reflection, I'd, p. 116. Is not the most naive form of representation mimesis? Like Nietzsche and the affinities do not end there. Artaud wants to have done with the imitative concept of art, with the Aristotelian aesthetics too in which the metaphysics of Western art comes into its own. Art is not the imitation of life, but life is the imitation of a transcendental principle which art puts us into communication with once again, OC 4:310. Theatrical art should be the primordial and privileged side of this destruction of imitation, more than any other art. It has been marked by the labor of total representation in which the affirmation of life lets itself be doubled and emptied by negation. This representation, whose structure is imprinted not only on the art, but on the entire culture of the West, its religions, philosophies, politics, therefore designates more than just a particular type of theatrical construction. This is why the question put to us today by far exceeds the bounds of theatrical technology. Such is Artaud's most obstinate affirmation, technical or theatrological reflection is not to be treated marginally. The decline of the theater doubtless begins with the possibility of such a dissociation. This can be emphasized without weakening the importance or interest of theatrological problems, or of the revolutions which may occur within the limits of theatrological problems, or of the revolutions which may occur within the limits of theatrical technique. But Artaud's intention indicates these limits. For as long as these technical and intra-theatrical revolutions do not penetrate the very foundations of Western theatre, they will belong to the history and to the stage that Antonin Artaud wanted to explode. What does it mean to break this structure of belonging? Is it possible to do so? Under what conditions can a theatre today legitimately invoke Artaud's name? It is only a fact that so many directors wish to be acknowledged as Artaud's heirs, that is, as has been written, his illegitimate sons. The question of justification and legality must also be raised. With what criteria can such a claim be recognized as unfounded? Under what conditions could an authentic theatre of cruelty begin to exist? These simultaneously technical and metaphysical questions, metaphysical in the sense understood by Artaud, arise spontaneously from the reading of all the texts in the theatre and its double, for these texts are more solicitations than a sum of precepts, more a system of critiques shaking the entirety of Occidental history than a treatise on theatrical practice. The theatre of cruelty f's God from the stage. It does not put a new atheist discourse on stage, or give atheism a platform, or give over theatrical space to a philosophizing logic that would once more, to our greater lassitude, proclaim the death of God. The theatrical practice of cruelty, in its action and structure, inhabits or rather produces a non-theological space. The stage is theological for as long as it is dominated by speech, by a will to speech, by the layout of a primary logos which does not belong to the theatrical site and governs it from a distance. The stage is theological for as long as its structure, following the entirety of tradition, comports the following elements: an author-creator who, absent and from afar, is armed with a text and keeps watch over, assembles, regulates the time or the meaning of representation, letting this latter represent him as concerns what is called the content of his thoughts, his intentions, his ideas. He lets representation represent him through representatives, directors, or actors, enslaved interpreters who represent characters who, primarily through what they say, more or less directly represent the thought of the creator. Interpretive slaves who faithfully execute the providential designs of the master. Who moreover, and this is the ironic rule of the representative structure which organizes all these relationships, creates nothing, has only the illusion of having created, because he only transcribes and makes available for reading a text whose nature is itself necessarily representative, and this representative text maintains with what is called the real, the existing real, the reality about which Artaud said, in the advertisement to Lemoyne, that it is an excrement of the mind. An imitative and reproductive relationship. Finally, the theological stage comports a passive, seated public, a public of spectators, of consumers, of enjoyers, as Nietzsche and Artaud both say, attending a production that lacks true volume or depth, a production that is level, offered to their voyeuristic scrutiny. In the theatre of cruelty, pure visibility is not exposed to voyeurism. This general structure in which each agency is linked to all the others by representation, in which the irrepresentability of the living present is dissimulated or dissolved, suppressed, or deported within the infinite chain of representations, this structure has never been modified. All revolutions have maintained it intact, and most often have tended to protect or restore it. And it is the phonetic text, speech, transmitted discourse eventually transmitted by the prompter whose whole is the hidden but indispensable center of representative structure which ensures the movement of representation. Whatever fear impertans, all the pictorial, musical, and even gesticular forms introduce one into Western theatre can only, in the best of cases, illustrate, accompany, serve, or decorate a text, a verbal fabric, a logo which is said in the beginning. If then, the author is the man who arranges the language of speech and the director is his slave, there is merely a question of words. There is here a confusion over terms, stemming from the fact that, for us, and according to the sense generally attributed to the word director, this man is merely an artisan, an adapter, a kind of translator eternally devoted to making a dramatic work pass from one language into another. This confusion will be possible, and the director will be forced to play second fiddle to the author only so long as there is a tacit agreement that the language of words is superior to others and that the theatre admits none other than this one language, FD, p. 119. This does not imply, of course, that to be faithful to Artaud it suffices to give a great deal of importance and responsibility to the director while maintaining the classical structure. By virtue of the word, or rather the unity of the word and the concept, as we will say later, and this specification will be important, and beneath the theological ascendancy both of the verb which is the measure of our impotency, OC 4:277, and of our fear, it is indeed the stage which finds itself threatened throughout the Western tradition. The Occidentan, such is the energy of its essence, has worked only for the erasure of the stage. For a stage which does /novel qg but illus_trait jt discourse is no longer entirely a stage. Its relation to speech is -1 ts-. That the epoch is sick, OC 4:280. Malady, and we repeat to reconstitute the stage, finally to put on stage and to overthrow the tyranny of the text is thus one and the same gesture. The triumph of pure mise en scene, OC 4:305. This classical forgetting of the stage is then confused with the history of theatre and with all of Western culture, indeed, it even guaranteed their unfolding. And yet, despite this forgetting, the theatre and its arts have lived richly for over 25 centuries, an experience of mutations and perturbations which cannot be set aside, despite the peaceful and impassive immobility of the fundamental structures. Thus, in question is not only a forgetting or a simple surface concealment. A certain stage has maintained with the forgotten, but, in truth, violently erased, stage a secret communication, a certain relationship of betrayal, if to betray is at once to detour through infidelity, but also to let oneself be evinced despite oneself, and to manifest the foundation of force. This explains why classical theatre, in Artaud's eyes, is not simply the absence, negation, or forgetting of theatre, is not a non-theatre, it is a mark of cancellation that lets what it covers be read, and it is corruption also, a perversion, a seduction, the margin of an aberration whose meaning and measure are visible only beyond birth, at the eve of theatrical representation, at the origin of tragedy. Or, for example, in the realm of the Orphic mysteries which subjugated Plato, or the mysteries of Eleusis stripped of the interpretations with which they have been covered, or the pure beauty of which Plato, at least once in this world, must have found the complete, sonorous, streaming naked realization, for, p. 52. Artaud is indeed speaking of perversion and not of forgetting. For example, in this letter to Benjamin Crémieux, the theatre, an independent and autonomous art, must, in order to revive or simply to live, realize what differentiates it from text, pure speech, literature, and all other fixed and written means. We can perfectly well continue to conceive of a theater based upon the authority of the text, and on a text more and more wordy, diffuse, and boring, to which the aesthetics of the stage would be subject. But this conception of theater, which consists of having people sit on a certain number of straight-backed or overstuffed chairs placed in a row and tell each other stories, however marvelous, is, if not the absolute negation of theater which does not absolutely require movement in order to be what it should, certainly its perversion. TD, p. 106, my italics. Released from the text and the author God, mice and scene would be returned to its creative and founding freedom. The director and the participants, who would no longer be actors or spectators, would cease to be the instruments and organs of representation. Is this to say that Artaud would have refused the name representation for the theater of cruelty? No, provided that we clarify the difficult and equivocal meaning of this notion. Here, we would have to be able to play upon all the genuine words that we indistinctly translate with the unique word representation. The stage, certainly, will no longer represent, since it will not operate as an addition, as the sensory illustration of a text already written, thought, or lived outside the stage, which the stage would then only repeat but whose fabric it would not constitute. The stage will no longer operate as the repetition of a present, will no longer represent a present that would exist elsewhere and prior to it, a priest degree that would exist elsewhere and prior to it, a present whose plenitude while one be older than it, absent from it, and rightfully capable of doing without it, the being present to itself of the absolute logos, the living present of God. Nor will the stage be a representation, if representation means the surface of a spectacle displayed for spectators. It will not even offer the presentation of a present, if present signifies that which is maintained in front of me. Cruel representation must penetrate me. And non-representation is, thus, original representation, if representation signifies, also, the unfolding of a volume, a multidimensional milieu, an experience which produces its own space. Spacing es spacement, that is to say, the production of a space that no speech could condense or comprehend, since speech primarily presupposes this spacing, thereby AP appeals to a time that is no longer that of so-called phonic linearity, appeals to a new notion of space and a specific idea of time, TD, p. 124. We intend to base the theater upon spectacle before everything else, and we shall introduce into the spectacle a new notion of space utilized on all possible levels and in all degrees of perspective in depth and height, and within this notion a specific idea of time will be added to that of movement. Thus, theater space will be utilized not only in its dimensions and volume but, so to speak, in its undersides, dans ses decis, TD, p. 124. Thus, the closure of classical representation, but also the reconstitution of a closed space of original representation, the arc a manifestation of force or of life. A closed space, that is to say a space produced from within itself and no longer organized from the vantage of another absent side, and illocally, an alibi or invisible utopia. The end of representation, but also original representation, the underscore end of interpretation, but also an original interpretation that no master speech, no project of mastery will have permeated and leveled in advance. A visible representation, certainly, directed against the speech which eludes sight, and Artaud insists upon the productive images without which there would be no theater, theaome, but whose visibility does not consist of a spectacle mounted by the discourse of the master. Representation, then, as the auto-presentation of pure visibility and even pure sensibility. 3. It is this extreme and difficult sense of spectacular representation that another passage from the same letter attempts to delimit, so long as the mise en scene remains, even in the minds of the boldest directors, a simple means of presentation, an accessory mode of expressing the work, a sort of spectacular intermediary with no significance of its own, it will be valuable only to the degree it succeeds in hiding itself behind the works it is pretending to serve, and this will continue as long as the major interest in a performed work is in its text, as long as literature takes precedence over the kind of performance improperly called spectacle, with everything pejorative, accessory, ephemeral, and external that term carries with it. TD, pages 105-6. S11ch, on the stage of cruelty, would be spectacle acting not as reflection, but as force, OC 4:297. The return to original representation thus implies, not simply but above all, that theater or life must cease to represent another language, must cease to let themselves be derived from another art, from literature, for example, be it poetic literature. For in poetry, as in literature, verbal representation purloins scenic representation. Poetry can escape Western illness only by becoming theater. We think, precisely, that there is a notion of poetry to be dissociated, extracted from the forms of written poetry in which an epoch at the height of disorder and illness wants to keep all poetry. And when I say that the epoch wants, I am exaggerating, for in reality it is incapable of wanting anything, it is the victim of a formal habit which it absolutely cannot shake. It seems to us that the kind of diffuse poetry which we identify with natural and spontaneous energy, but all natural energies are not poetic, must find its integral expression, its purest, sharpest and most truly separated expression, in the theater, OC 4:280. Thus, we can distinguish the sense of cruelty as necessity and rigor. Artaud certainly invites us to think only of rigor, implacable intention and decision, and of irreversible and absolute determination, TD, p. 101, of determinism, submission to necessity, id, p. 102, etc., under the heading of cruelty, and not necessarily of sadism, horror, bloodshed, crucified enemies, ibid, etc., and certain productions today inscribed under Artaud's name are perhaps violent, even bloody, but are not, for all that, cruel. Nevertheless, there is always a murder at the origin of cruelty, of the necessity named cruelty. And, first of all, a parricide. The origin of theater, such as it must be restored, is the J1 and lift head underscore against you, he abusive wielder of the logos, against the father, against the god of a stage subugitadrali p underscore backslash vetofs and text. For in my view no one has the right to call himself author, that is to say creator, except the person who controls the direct handling of the stage. And exactly here is the vulnerable point of the theater as it is thought of not only in France but in Europe and even in the Occident as a whole. Occidental theater recognizes as language, assigns the faculties and powers of a language, permits to be called language, with that particular intellectual dignity generali ascribed to this word, only articulated language, grammatically articulated language, i.e., the language of speech, and of written speech, speech which, pronounced or unpronounced, has no greater value than if it is merely written. In the theater as we conceive it, the text is everything. TD, p. 117. What will speech become, henceforth, in the theater of cruelty? Will it simply have to silence itself or disappear? In no way. Speech will cease to govern the stage, but will be present upon it. /1 Speech will occupy a rigorously delimited place, will have a function within a system to which it will be coordinated. For it is known that the representations of the theater of cruelty had to be painstakingly determined in advance. The absence of an author and his text does not abandon the stage to dereliction. The stage is not forsaken, given over to improvisatory anarchy, to chance vaticination, OC 4:234, to copia's improvisations, TD, p. 109, to surrealist empiricism, OC 4:313, to commedia dell'arte, or to the capriciousness of untrained inspiration, ibid. Everything, thus, will be prescribed in a writing and a text whose fabric will no longer resemble the model of classical representation. To what place, then, will speech be assigned by this necessary prescription called for by cruelty itself? Speech and its notation phonetic speech, an element of classical theater. One speech and its writing will be erased on the stage of cruelty only in the extent to dash, which they were allegedly dictation, at once citations or recitations and orders. 1. The director and the actor will no longer take dictation, thus we shall renounce the theatrical superstitio 1,1 of the text and the dictatorship of the writer, id. p. 124. This is also the end of the diction which made theater into an exercise of reading. The end of the fact that for certain theatrical amateurs this means that a play read affords just as definite and as great a satisfaction as the same play performed, id. p. 118. How will speech and writing function then? They will once more become gestures, and the logical and discursive intentions which speech ordinarily uses in order to ensure its rational transparency, and in order to purloin its body in the direction of meaning, will be reduced or subordinated. And since this theft of the body by itself is indeed that which leaves the body to be strangely concealed by the very thing that constitutes it as diaphanousness, then the deconstitution of diaphanousness lays bare the flesh of the word, lays bare the word's sonority, intonation, intensity, the shout that the articulations of language and logic have not yet entirely frozen, that is, the aspect of oppressed gesture which remains in L1 speech, the unique and irreplaceable movement which the generalities of concept and repetition have never finished rejecting. We know what value Artaud attributed to what is called in the present case, quite incorrectly, onomatopoeia. Glossopoeia, which is neither an imitative language nor a creation of names, takes us back to the borderline of the moment when the word has not yet been born, when articulation is no longer a shout but not yet discourse, when repetition is almost impossible, and along with it, language in general, the separation of concept and sound, of signified and signifier, of the pneumatical and the grammatical, the freedom of translation and tradition, the movement of interpretation, the difference between the soul and the body, the master and the slave, God and man, author and actor. This is the eve of the origin of languages, and of the dialogue between theology and humanism whose inextinguishable reoccurrence has never not been maintained by the metaphysics of Western theater. 5. Thus, it is less a question of constructing a mute stage than of constructing a stage whose clamor has not yet been pacified into words. The word is the cadaver of psychic speech, and along with the language of life itself the speech before word 6 must be found again. Gesture and speech have not yet been separated by the logic of representation. I am adding another language to the spoken language, and I am trying to restore to the language of speech its old magic, its essential spellbinding power, for its mysterious possibilities have been forgotten. When I say I will perform no written play, I mean that I will perform no play based on writing and speech, that in the spectacles I produce there will be a preponderant physical share which could not be captured and written down in the customary language of words, and that even the spoken and written portions will be spoken and written in a new sense, id. p. 111. What of this new sense? And first, what of this new theatrical writing? This latter will no longer occupy the limited position of simply being the notation of words, but will cover the entire range of this new language, not only phonetic writing and the transcription of speech, but also hieroglyphic writing, the writing in which phonetic elements are coordinated to visual, pictorial, and plastic elements. The notion of hieroglyphics is at the center of the first manifesto. Once aware of this language in space, language of sounds, cries, lights, onomatopoeia, the theater must organize it into veritable hieroglyphs, with the help of characters and objects, and make use of their symbolism and interconnections in relation to all organs and on all levels, id. p. 90. On the stage of the dream, as described by Freud, speech has the same status. This analogy requires patient meditation. In the interpretation of dreams and in the metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams the place and functioning of writing are delimited. Present in dreams, speech can only be have as an element among others, sometimes like a thing which the primary process manipulates according to its own economy. In this process thoughts are transformed into images, mainly of a visual sort, that is to say, word presentations are taken back to the thing presentations which correspond to them, as if, in general the process were dominated by considerations of representability, Darstellbarket. It is very noteworthy how little the dream work keeps to word presentations. It is always ready to exchange one word for another till it finds the expression which is most handy for plastic representation, SE 14:228. Artaud 2 speaks of a visual and plastic materialization of speech, TD, p. 69, and of making use of speech in a concrete and spatial sense in order to manipulate it like a solid object, one which overturns and disturbs things, TD, p. 72. And when Freud, speaking of dreams, invokes sculpture and painting, or the primitive painter who, in the fashion of the authors of comic strips, hung small labels, from the mouths of the persons represented, containing in written characters the speeches which the artist despaired of representing pictorially, SE 4:312, we understand what speech can become when it is but an element, a circumscribed sight, a circumvented writing within both general writing and the space of representation. This is the structure of the rebus or the hieroglyphic. The dream content, on the other hand, is expressed as it were in a pictographic script, SE 4:227. And in an article from 1913, for in what follows speech must be understood not merely to mean the expression of thought in words but to include the speech of gesture and every other method, such, for instance, as writing, by which mental activity can be expressed. If we reflect that the means of representation in dreams are principally visual images and not words, we shall see that it is even more appropriate to compare dreams with a system of writing than with a language. In fact, the interpretation of dreams is completely analogous to the decipherment of an ancient pictographic script such as Egyptian hieroglyphs, SE 13:176-77. 7. It is difficult to know the extent to which Artaud, who often referred to psychoanalysis, had approached the text of Freud. It is in any event remarkable that he describes the play of speech and of writing on the stage of Cruelty according to Freud's very terms, a Freud who at the time was hardly elucidated. Already in the first manifesto, The Language of the Stage, it is not a question of suppressing the spoken language, but of giving words approximately the importance they have in dreams. Meanwhile, new means of recording this language must be found, /SLU/ whether these means belong to musical transcription or to some kind of code. As for ordinary objects, or even the human body, raised to the dignity of signs, it is evident that one can draw one's inspiration from hieroglyphic characters TD, p94. Eternal laws, those of all poetry and all Bible language, and, among other things, of Chinese ideograms and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Hence, far from restricting the possibilities of theater and language, on the pretext that I will not perform written plays, I extend the language of the stage and multiply its possibilities TD, p111. As concerns psychoanalysis and especially psychoanalysts, Artaud was no less careful to indicate his distance from those who believe that they can retain discourse with the aid of psychoanalysis, and thereby can wield its initiative and powers of initiation. For the theater of cruelty is indeed a theater of dreams, but of cruel dreams, that is to say, absolutely necessary and determined dreams, dreams calculated and given direction, as opposed to what Artaud believed to be the empirical disorder of spontaneous dreams. The ways and figures of dreams can be most-heard. The surrealists read Hervé de Saint Denis. 8 in this theatrical treatment of dreams, poetry, and science must henceforth be identical, TD, p140. To make them such, it is certainly necessary to proceed according to the modern magic that is psychoanalysis. I propose to bring back into the theater this elementary magic idea, taken up by modern psychoanalysis, TD, p80. But no concession must be made to what Artaud believes to be the faltering of dreams and of the unconscious. It is T of DRAMS that must be produced or reproduced. I propose to renounce our empiricism of imagery, in which the unconscious furnishes images at random, and which the poet arranges at random too, ibid. Because he wants to see sparkle and triumph on stage whatever is part of the illegibility and magnetic fascination of dreams, CW 223, Artaud therefore rejects the psychoanalyst as interpreter, second remove commentator, hermeneut, or theoretician. He would have rejected a psychoanalytic theater with as much rigor as he condemned psychological theater. And for the same reasons, his rejection of any secret interiority, of the reader, of directive interpretations or of psychodramaturgy. The subconscious will not play any true role on stage. We've had enough of the confusion engendered between author and audience through the medium of producers and actors. Too bad for analysts, students of the soul and surrealists. We are determined to safeguard the plays we put on one against any secret commentary, CW 239.9 by virtue of his situation and his /status, the psychoanalyst would belong to the structure of the classical stage, to its societal form, its metaphysics, its religion, etc. IT11E theater of cruelty thus would not be a theater of the unconscious. Almost. The contrary. Cruelty is, cons I, at T1S1 is exposed lucidity. There is no cruelty without consciousness and without the application of consciousness, id. p. 1I 102. And this consciousness indeed lives upon a murder, is the consciousness of this murder, as we suggested above. Artaud says this in the first letter on cruelty, it is consciousness that gives to the exercise of every act of life its blood-red color, its cruel nuance, since it is understood that life is always someone's death, id. p. 102. Perhaps Artaud is also protesting against a certain Freudian description of dreams as the substitutive fulfillment of desire, as the function of vicariousness. Through the theater, Artaud wants to return their dignity to dreams and to make of them something more original, more free, more affirmative than an activity of displacement. It is perhaps against a certain image of Freudian thought that he writes in the first manifesto, to consider the theater as a second-hand psychological or moral function, and to believe that dreams themselves have only a substitute function, is to diminish the profound poetic bearing of dreams as well as of the theater, id. p. 92. Finally, a psychoanalytic theater would risk being a desacralizing theater, and thereby would confirm the West in its project and its trajectory. The theater of cruelty is a hieratic theater. Regression toward the unconscious, CFTD, p. 47, fails if it does not reawaken the sacred, if it is not both the mystic experience of revelation and the manifestation of life in their first emergence. 10. We have seen the reasons why hieroglyphics had to be substituted for purely phonic signs. It must be added that the latter communicate less than the former with the imagination of the sacred. And through the hieroglyph of a breath I am able to recover an idea of the sacred theater, id. p. 141. A new epiphany of the supernatural and the divine must occur within cruelty. And not despite but thanks to the eviction of God and the destruction of the theater's theological machinery. The divine has been ruined by God. That is to say, by man, who in permitting himself to be separated from life by God, in permitting himself to be usurped from his own birth, became man by polluting the divinity of the divine. For far from believing man invented the supernatural and the divine, I think it is man's age-old intervention which has ultimately corrupted the divine within him, id. p. 8. The restoration of divine cruelty, hence, must traverse the murder of God, that is to say, primarily the murder of the man-God. 11. Perhaps we now can ask, not about the conditions under which a modem theater could be faithful to Artaud, but in what cases it is surely unfaithful to him. What might the themes of infidelity be, even among those who invoke Artaud in the militant and noisy fashion we all know? We will content ourselves with naming these themes. Without a doubt, foreign to the theater of cruelty are, all non-sacred theater. All theater that privileges speech or rather the verb, all theater of words, even if this privilege becomes that of a speech which is self-destructive, which once more becomes gesture of hopeless reoccurrence, a negative relation of speech to itself, theatrical nihilism, what is still called the theater of the absurd. Such a theater would not only be consumed by speech, and would not destroy the functioning of the classical stage, but it also would not be, in the sense understood by Artaud, arid doubtless by Nietzsche, an affirmation. All abstract theater which excludes something from the totality of art, and thus, from the totality of life and its resources of signification, dance, music, volume, depth of plasticity, visible images, sonority, phonicity, etc. An abstract theater is a theater in which the totality of sense and the senses is not consumed. One would incorrectly conclude from this that it suffices to accumulate or to juxtapose all the arts in order to create a total theater addressed to the toter man. 12, CFTD, p. 123. Nothing could be further from addressing total man than an assembled totality, an artificial and exterior mimicry. Inversely, certain apparent exhaust ions of stage technique sometimes more rigorously pursue a Artaud's trajectory. Assuming, which we do not, that there is some sense in speaking of a fidelity to Artaud, to something like his message, this notion already betrays him, then a rigorous, painstaking, patient, and implacable sobriety in the work of destruction, and an economical acuity aiming at the master parts of a still quite solid machine, are more surely imperative, today, than the general mobilization of art and artists, than turbulence, or improvised agitation under the mocking and tranquilize of the police. All theater of alienation. Alienation only consecrates, with didactic insistence and systematic heaviness, the non-participation of spectators, and even of directors and actors, in the creative act, in the eruptive force fissuring the space of the stage. The Verfremdungseffekt 13 remains the prisoner of a classical paradox and of the European ideal of art which attempts to cast the mind into an attitude distinct from force but addicted to exaltation, td. p. 10. Since in the theater of cruelty the spectator is in the center and the spectacle surrounds him, td. p. 81, the distance of vision is no longer pure, cannot be abstracted from the totality of the sensory milieu, the infused spectator can no longer constitute his spectacle and provide himself with its object. There is no longer spectator or spectacle, but festival, cftd. p. 85. All the limits for rowing C1 asical theatricality, represented/representer, signified/signifier, author/director/actors/spectators, stage/audience, text/interpretation, etc., were ethico-metaphysical prohibitions, rinkies, grimaces, rictuses the symptoms of fear before the dangers of the festival. Within the space of the festival opened by transgression, the distance of representation should no longer be extendable. The festival of cruelty lifts all footlights and protective barriers before the absolute danger which is without foundation. I must have actors who are first of all beings, that is to say, who on stage are not afraid of the true sensation of the touch of a knife and the convulsions absolutely real for them of a supposed birth. Mounet Sully believes in what he does and gives the illusion of it, but he knows that he is behind a protective barrier. Me, I suppress the protective barrier. Letter to Roger Blinn, September 1945. As regards the festival, as invoked by Artaud, and the menace of that which is without foundation, the happening can only make us smile. It is lo the theater of cruelty what the carnival of nice might be to the mysteries of Eleusis. This is particularly so due to the fact that the happening substitutes political agitation for the total revolution prescribed by Artaud. The festival must be a political act, and the act of political revolution is theatrical. All non-political theater. We have indeed said that the festival must be a political act and not the more or less eloquent, pedagogical, and superintended transmission of a concept or a politico-moral vision of the world. To reflect which we cannot do here the political sense of this act and this festival, and the image of society which fascinates Artaud's desire, one should come to invoke, in order to note the greatest difference within the greatest affinity, all the elements in Rousseau which establish communication between the critique of the classical spectacle, the suspect quality of articulation in language, the ideal of a public festival substituted for representation, and a certain model of society perfectly present to itself in small communities which render both useless and nefarious all recourse to representation at the decisive moments of social life. That is, all recourse to political as well as to theatrical representation, replacement, or delegation. It very precisely could be shown that it is the representer that Rousseau suspects in the social contract, as well as in the letter to M.D. Alembert, where he proposes the replacement of theatrical representations with public festivals lacking all exhibition and spectacle, festivals without anything to see in which the spectators themselves would become actors, but what then will be the objects of these entertainments? Nothing, if you please. Plant a stake crowned with flowers in the middle of a square, gather the people together there, and you will have a festival. Do better yet, let the spectators become an entertainment to themselves, make them actors themselves. 14 All ideological theater, all cultural theater, all communicative, interpretive, in the popular and not the Nietzschean sense, of course, theater seeking to transmit a content or to deliver a message, of whatever nature, political, religious, psychological, metaphysical, etc., that would make a discourse's meaning intelligible for its listeners. 15 A message that would not be totally exhausted in the act and present tense of the stage, that would not coincide with the stage, that could be repeated without it. Here we touch upon what seems to be the profound essence of Artaud's project, his historic, metaphysical decisi, and Artaud wanted to erase repetition in general. 16 For him, repet 1t1 on was evil, and one could doubtless organize an entire reading of his texts around this center. Repetiton separates force, presence, and life from themselves. This separation is the economical and calculating gesture of that which defers itself in order to maintain itself, that which reserves expenditure and surrenders to fear. This power of repetition governed everything that Artaud wished to destroy, and it has several names: God, being, dialectics. God is the eternity whose death goes on indefinite /inidly, whose death, as difference and repetition within life, has never ceased to menace life. It is not the living God, but the death God that we should fear. God is death. For even the infinite is dead, /infinite is the name of a dead man who is not dead. 84. As soon as there is repetition, God is there, the present holds on to itself and reserves itself, that is to say, eludes itself. The absolute is not a being and will never be one, for there can be no being without a crime committed against myself, that is to say, without taking from me a being who wanted one day to be God when this is not possible, God being able to manifest himself only all at once, given that he manifests himself an infinite number of times during all the times of eternity as the infinity of times and eternity, which creates perpetuity. September 1945. Another name of repetition, being. Being is the form in which the infinite diversity of the forms and forces of life and death can indefinitely merge and be repeated in the word. For there is no word, nor in general a sign, which is not constituted by the possibility of repeating itself. A sign which does not repeat itself, which is not already divided by repetition in its first time, is not a sign. The signifying referral therefore must be ideal, and ideality is but the assured power of repetition in order to refer to the same thing each time. This is why being is the key word of eternal repetition, the victory of God and of death over life. Like Nietzsche, for example, in The Birth of Philosophy, Artaud refuses to subsume life to being, and inverses the genealogical order, first to live and to be according to one's soul. The problem of being is only their consequence. September 1945, there is no greater enemy of the human body than being. September 1947, certain other unpublished texts valorize what Artaud properly calls the beyond of being. February 1947, manipulating this expression of Plato's, whom Artaud did not fail to read, in a Nietzschean style. Finally, dialectics is the movement through which expenditure is reappropriated into presence. It is the economy of repetition. The economy of truth. Repetition summarizes negativity, gathers and maintains the past priest as truth, a ideality. The truth is aloys that wick can be repeated. Non-repetitone, expend one tour that one's resolute and without return the unique time consuming the present, must put an end to fearful discursiveness, to unskirtable ontology, to dialectics. Dialectics a certain dialectics being that which finished me, September 1945, 17 dialectics is always that which has finished us, because it is always that which takes into account our rejection of it, as it does our affirmation. To reject death as repetition is to affirm death as a present expenditure without return. And inversely. This is a schema that hovers around Nietzsche's repetition of affirmation. Pure expenditure, absolute generosity offering the unicity of the present to death in order to make the present appear as such, has already begun to want to maintain the presence of the present, has already opened the book and memory, the thinking of being as memory. Not to want to maintain the present is to want to preserve that which constitutes its irreplaceable and mortal presence, that within it which cannot be repeated. To consume pure difference with pleasure such, reduced to its bloodless framework, is the matrix of the history of thought conceptualizing itself since Hegel. 18 The possibility of the theater is the obligatory focal point of this thought which reflects tragedy as repetition. The menace of repetition is nowhere else as well organized as in the theater. Nowhere else is one so close to the stage as the origin of repetition, so close to the primitive repetition which would have to be erased, and only by detaching it from itself as if from its double. Not in the sense in which Artaud spoke of the theater and its tool jail, 19 but as designating the fold, the interior duplication which steals the simple presence of its present act from the theater, from life, etc., in the irrepressible movement of repetition. One time is the enigma of that which has no meaning, no presence, no legibility. Now, for Artaud, the festival of cruelty could take place only one time. Let us leave textual criticism to graduate students, formal criticism to aesthetes, and recognize that what has been said is not still to be said, that an expression does not have the same value twice, does not live two lives, that all words, once spoken, are dead and function only at the moment when they are uttered, that a form, once it has served, cannot be used again and asks only to be replaced by another, and that the theater is the only place in the world where a gesture, one made, can never be made the same way twice, id. p. 75. This is indeed how things appear. Theatrical representation is finite, and leaves behind its actual presence, no trace, no object to carry off. It is neither a book nor a work, but an energy, and in this sense it is the only art of life. The theater teach precisely the uselessness of the action which, once done, is not to be done, and the superior use of the state unused by the action and which, restored, produces a purification, id. p. 82. In this sense the theater of cruelty would be the art of difference and of expenditure without economy, without reserve, without return, without history. Pure presence as pure difference. Its act must be forgotten, actively forgotten. Here, one must practice the active Vergeslichkeit which is spoken of in the second dissertation of the genealogy of morals, which also explicates festivity and cruelty, Grausamkeit. Artaud's disgust with non-theatrical writing has the same sense. What inspires this disgust is not, as in the Phaedrus, the gesture of the body, the sensory and mnemonic, the hypomnesiac mark exterior to the inscription of truth in the soul, but, on the contrary, writing as the side of the inscription of truth, the other of the living body, writing as ideality, repetition. Plato criticizes writing as a body, Artaud criticizes it as the erasure of the be, of the living gesture which takes place only once. Writing is space itself and the possibility of repetition in general. This is why we should get rid of our superstitious valuation of texts and written poetry. Written poetry is worth reading once, and then should be destroyed, id. p. 78. In thus enumerating the themes of infidelity, one comes to understand very quickly that fidelity is impossible. There is no theater in the world today which fulfills Artaud's desire. And there would be no exception to be made for the attempts made by Artaud himself. He knew this better than any other. The grammar of the theater of cruelty, of which he said that it is to be found, will always remain the inaccessible limit of a representation which is not repetition, of a representation which is full presence, which does not carry its double within itself as its death, of a present which does not repeat itself, that is, of a present outside time, a non-present. The present offers itself as such, appears, presents itself, opens the stage of time or the time of the stage only by harboring its own intestine difference, and only in the interior fold of its original repetition in representation. In dialectics. Artaud knew this well, a certain dialectics. For if one appropriately conceives the horizon of dialectics outside a conventional Hegelianism one understands, perhaps, that dialectics is the indefinite movement of finitude, of the unity of life and death, of difference, of original repetition, that is, of the origin of tragedy as the absence of a simple origin. In this sense, dialectics is tragedy, the only possible affirmation to be made against the philosophical or Christian idea of pure origin, against the spirit of beginnings, but the spirit of beginnings has not ceased to make me commit idiocies, and I have not ceased to dissociate myself from the spirit of beginnings which is the Christian spirit, September 1945. What is tragic is not the impossibility but the necessity of repetition. Artaud knew that the theater of cruelty neither begins nor is completed within the purity of simple presence, but rather is already within representation, in the second time of creation, in the conflict of forces which could not be that of a one simple origin. Doubtless, cruelty could begin to be practiced within this conflict. But thereby it must also let itself be penetrated. The origin is always penetrated. Such is the alchemy of the theater. Perhaps before proceeding further I shall be asked to define what I mean by the archetypal, primitive theater. And we shall thereby approach the very heart of the matter. If in fact we raise the question of the origins and raison d'etre, or primordial necessity, of the theater, we find, metaphysically, the materialization or rather the exteriorization of a kind of essential drama, a heady disposed and divided, not so much as to lose their character as principles, but enough to comprise, in a substantial and active fashion, i.e. resonantly, an infinite perspective of conflicts. To analyze such a drama philosophically is impossible, only poetically. And this essential drama, we come to realize, exists, and in the image of something subtler than creation itself, something which must be represented as the result of one will alone and without conflict. We must believe that the essential drama, one at the root of all the great mysteries, is associated with the second phase of creation, that of difficulty and of the double, that of matter and the materialization of the idea. It seems indeed that where simplicity and order reign, there can be no theater nor drama, and the true theater, like poetry as well, though by other means, is born out of a kind of organized anarchy. Td. pages 50 to 51. Primitive theater and cruelty thus also begin by repetition. But if the idea of a theater without representation, the idea of the impossible, does not help us to regulate theatrical practice, it does, perhaps, permit us to conceive its origin, eve, and limit, and the horizon of its death. The energy of Western theater thus lets itself be encompassed within its own possibility, which is not accidental and serves as a constitutive center and structuring locus for the entire history of the West. But repetition steals the center and the locus, and what we have just said of its possibility should prohibit us from speaking both of death as a horizon and of birth as a past opening. Artaud kept himself as close as possible to the limit, the possibility and impossibility of pure theater. Presence, in order to be presence and self-presence, J has always already begun to represent itself, has always already been penetrated. Affirmation itself must be penetrated in repeating itself. Which means that the murder of the father which opens the history of representation and the space of tragedy, the murder of the father that Artaud, in sum, wants to repeat at the greatest proximity to its origin but only a single time, this murder is endless and is repeated indefinitely. It begins by penetrating its own commentary and is accompanied by its own representation, in which it erases itself and confirms the transgressed law. To do so, it suffices that there be a sign, that is to say, a repetition. Underneath this side of the limit, and in the extent to which he wanted to save the purity of a presence without interior difference and without repetition, or, paradoxically amounting to the same thing, the purity of a pure difference, 20 Artaud also desired the impossibility of the theater, wanted to erase the stage, no / longer wanted to see what transpires in a locality always inhabited or haunted by the father and subjected to the repetition of murder. Is it not Artaud who wants to reduce the arca stage when he writes in the Here Lies, I Antonin Artaud, am my son, I my father, my mother, / and myself, a. p. 238? That he thereby kept himself at the limit of theatrical possibility, and that he simultaneously wanted to produce and to annihilate the stage, is what he knew in the most extreme way. December 1946, and now I am going to say something which, perhaps, is going to stupefy many people. I am the enemy of theater. I have always been. As much as I love the theater, I am, for this very reason, equally its enemy. We see him immediately afterward, he cannot resign himself to theater as repetition, and cannot renounce theater as non-repetition. The theater is a passionate overflowing, a frightful transfer of forces from body to body. This transfer cannot be reproduced twice. Nothing more impious than the system of the Balinese, which consists, after having produced this transfer one time, instead of seeking another, in resorting to a system of particular enchantments in order to deprive astral photography of the gestures thus obtained. Theater as repetition of that which does not repeat itself, theater as the original repetition of difference within the conflict of forces in which evil is the permanent law, and what is good is an effort and already a cruelty added to the other cruelty, such is the fatal limit of a cruelty which begins with its own representation. Because it has always already begun, representation therefore has no end. But one can conceive of the closure of that which is without end. Closure is the circular limit within which the repetition of difference infinitely repeats itself. That is to say, closure is its playing space. This movement is the movement of the world as play. And for the absolute life itself is a game, OC 4:282, this play is cruelty as the unity of necessity and chance. It is chance that is infinite, not God, fragmentations. This play of life is artistic. 21 To think the closure of representation is thus to think the cruel powers of death and play which permit presence to be born to itself, and pleasurably to consume _ itself here the representation in which it eludes itself in its deferral. To think closure of representation is to think the tragic, not as representation of one fate, but as the fate of representation. Its gratuitous and baseless necessity.